our next seminar in the Center for Research on Language Diversity series. And as Stephen mentioned, we have recorded the previous seminars and you can see them on our YouTube page, which is linked from the center's website. Today I'd like to introduce Carolin Krafzik, who's a PhD student here at Trobe University. She comes to us from Germany. She did her undergraduate degree in English and German studies at the University of Rostock, and then did a master's degree in foreign language linguistics at the University of Potsdam. And last year she came to us to start her PhD in linguistics here at La Trobe. And her main interest is on swearing in English, with a specific interest in swearing in Australian English. And that should give her lots of data if you've ever talked to Australians in informal contexts. So I'll hand over to Carolin to talk about student swearing in Sydney.
Thank you. So shall I just go ahead and share my screen?
Yes.
Okay, if it works. Oops, I was one too quick. Okay. I hope everyone can see this, and yeah, it looks like it's working. Okay, good. So yeah, hello everybody. Again, my name is Carolin Krafzik. Difficult name, so I'll move on. So I'm going to talk about a little bit what I've worked on so far on swearing in Australian English. I worked on this for my master thesis a while back in 2016 already, and I'm continuing now with my PhD. And today I'm going to show you some of my results from my master thesis, as I don't have results at this point from my PhD yet, and I'm hoping to begin with data collection as soon as all the COVID-19 restrictions are over and I can go into the public and attend large events as I plan to recruit people and things like that. Okay, so I wanted to start off with some impressions from Australia that I took with my smartphone. This is a sign I took a picture of on a train from Sydney to the Blue Mountains, which I found very interesting, that there's a specific sign, relatively large, asking people not to swear. And there's a little two people, and they're actually happily swearing, while the person next to it is kind of maybe offended. So I found that pretty emblematic for what I'm going to talk about. Ever since I arrived in Australia for the first time in 2016, and also for the second time when I came here for my PhD last year, I always took pictures around the town when I saw any kind of swearing included in any kind of signs, advertising, whatsoever, shop names. And I think because I keep finding a lot of those, I find that emblematic of the presence of swearing in Australian life. And here on this slide, you can see a sign on the left, in the left top corner. This is a sign from a train in Melbourne, so not as cute as the one in Sydney, but also specifically asking not to use offensive language. So there might be a need for that, or a felt need for that. And here I have a couple of other pictures, like two clubs or two bars asking people to observe the no dickhead policy. Below here, there's a shop. That's a shop in St. Kilda called The Bitch's Back. And next to it, there are two advertisements for some pubs, and one involves not swearing but euphemism, crikey. And then we have the Tight Ass Tuesdays. I believe I took that picture, I don't want to lie, somewhere near the city centre in Melbourne. On the top, we have the Very Damn Good Bar. That's a bar you can buy on campus in Bandura at La Trobe University. And I also took two pictures of advertisements on buses and trams. The Billy Elliot, a bloody brilliant musical, I took of a tram in Melbourne a couple months back. And the other one, Don't Settle for a Crocker Shit, which I find extremely cute. I took just recently, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, on a bus going to Bandura campus. And on top we have the bloody long walk that you can take in Sydney along the coast. And that picture I took in 2016. Yeah, so I think this is like a nice overview. And this is really just a small selection of all the pictures that I took. I wanted to also highlight the usage of swearing I recently observed on Instagram or social media. I found it interesting that the ABC News account on Instagram posted a story from a man living in China when COVID-19 first broke out, and there were a couple of stories where he talked about the situation, and he swore a lot. The swearing was bleeped, as you can see in the picture also. But I found that interesting that a major news outlet would post that with all the swearing in there, even though, okay, bleep, but the city of Melbourne also posted something saying, hell yes. Very much swearing to, I must admit, but it is there. Time Out Melbourne posted something saying 22 ways not to be a dick as a pedestrian in Melbourne. And the Netflix account for Australia and New Zealand is specifically funny, I think, saying like normal Netflix, but way more comfortable swearing. And if you follow that account, you will come across a lot of swearing. Like the example below from Kath and Kim. Yeah, so this is what I observe in my daily life. And I'm sure a lot of you do too. I'm just very conscious of everything. And I want to talk a little bit about why swearing might be so visible in Australian life. So swearing, in fact, has a long history in Australia and goes back to the late 18th and early 19th century. And the settlers who arrived in Australia, and there were not only convicts but other working class settlers from the British Isles and Ireland, and they brought with them a particular kind of slang and working class language and dialect, which incorporated a fair amount of swearing, which has been reported also by a traveler called Henry William Haygarth in 1848. who said Australian English, who said profane swearing prevails throughout the interior of New South Wales to an extent hardly conceivable, but by those who have actually witnessed it. Oh, I just noticed that I switched the quotes here with the pictures, sorry. And the Macquarie Dictionary of Australian English actually in its introduction states that Australian English not always enjoyed a good reputation. At one time, the very phrase Australian language implied bad language, especially slang and swearing. Yeah, and looking at research and other research in the field of swearing and Australian English, I found a lot of evidence or signs that Australians are known for their creativity with colloquialisms, like Colin says, especially with vulgar expressions. According to Leitner, the Australian fondness for colloquialism goes beyond the covert prestige of similar language in the British or American context. And Davis claims that the most distinctive aspect of Australian English lies in its creative use of obscenities. And Allen and Berridge also marked that the colloquial idiom, which includes swearing, not just swearing, but diminutives and other slang, is perceived as a significant part of many Australians' cultural identity, which I find very interesting. So I was wondering, is swearing part of Australian identity, maybe? That's something I want to look into in my research. Okay, but before we move on, I want to talk a little bit about what swearing actually is. Surely everybody has an idea what swearing is, and I've shown you plenty of examples already. But when you're trying to pin down what it is, it actually turns out to be a bit fuzzy. It starts with the multitude of terminology that is out there for swearing. You could call it bad, curse, cuss words, dirty words, four-letter words, bawdy, foul, rude, vulgar, taboo language, and so on. So there's a lot of different terms out there, and they're all sort of overlapping, similar, related, and it's kind of hard to pin down what to use. I'm going to stick with the label swearing to cover everything. And for my master's thesis, I did a very thorough read through of all the definitions that are out there, and I came up with this definition based on Allen and Berridge, Anderson and Trudgill, Bears, Ferguson, Hughes, Jay, Jung, McAnery, and Stapleton. A lot of different sources, but I came up with this definition. So swearing, in my opinion, is a phenomenon that makes reference, literally or non-literally, to objects, behavior, or concepts considered taboo in society, and often, but not always, involves some kind of expression of emotion. So we have two key aspects here. Swearing involves taboo, cultural taboo, and maybe emotion, and it can be literal or non-literal. So the main anchor point here for when we talk about swearing is that we touch on some kind of culturally established taboo. And that is what swearing gives the strength it has. When you're kind of breaking a taboo and using tabooed language. So when looking at swearing, there's a lot of different aspects that have to be taken into account. One is that there's a range of different themes employed when we swear, and these are, for instance, animals, food, disease, death, smell, dirt. These come largely from Allen and Burritt's work. Not all of these have a lot of swear words attached to them, but these are taboo themes we can observe in culture. There's also mental, behavioral, and physical abnormalities. For instance, like what an asshole is behavioral abnormality. There's also the taboo theme of effluvia, body organs, and sexual behavior, which is very productive in swearing. And then we have blasphemy and profanity, which is still in use, but in my opinion has lost some of its strength that it might have had prior. And then we have so-called ist taboo themes, which refer to sexism, racism, homophobia, things like that. Is there any difference in the frequency of swearing between Australia and New Zealand? Well, there is not a lot of, I've read a bit about New Zealand swearing, and I've looked at other research done with students in New Zealand, and from at least comparing to my work, it appears to be fairly similar. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. Thank you for the question. Yeah, and you're right about saying there was no such convict immigrants in New Zealand. The language is not really convict language or convict swearing, since yeah, it's more the working class, lower class social slang and dialect that was present among the convict population, but also general population, as free settlers came fairly early to Australia and exceeded the numbers of convicts pretty quickly. So yeah, it's not really based on convict terms. Right, okay, another aspect of swearing that's important are the functions that swearing can exert. I have four major functions here: expletive, abusive, stylistic, and humorous. I think these are stylistic refers to when you're trying to spice up conversation a bit. There's different kinds of ways using swearing for stylistic purposes, and obviously also maybe for humorous reasons. Let's move on quickly because I want to get to the examples. And lastly, the important aspects of swearing also are the morphosyntax, so the forms in which swearing can appear. Largely it's single words or compounds, but we can also sometimes find infixes like fan, fucking-tastic, or fuckity shit fuck. And the pragmatics are obviously also important for swearing. I'm gonna go into that more when I talk about my results from my masterpieces. And social variables are also of importance. For my masterpieces, I only looked at differences between the genders because there was just not enough space to look at other variables. But I did collect a lot of data on the other variables and hope to, at some point, also evaluate those. And euphemism as a counter practice to swearing has also been addressed in my research. And yeah, I'm going to talk about that in the results section as well. Okay, so let's get to my study from my master thesis. So in 2016, I spent 3 months in Sydney, and the students there seem to swear. I took these pictures from flyers I found around campus at Macquarie University, where I stayed as a visiting scholar. And here on the bottom, there's a sign that I put up for interviews I had on swearing, and someone added bloody to it, which I found hilarious. So what was my project in detail? So the goal of my master thesis was to provide a description of swearing in Australian English based on self-reporting, which of course is not as reliable as looking at actual spoken data. But yeah, that was what I was going off. For my PhD, I'm gonna record people and try to look at actual spoken data. So the target group for my master thesis were only university students, all studying at Macquarie University. And I had an online questionnaire and did face-to-face interviews. Overall, I had 69 participants aged 18 to 26. There were 40 females and 29 males. And 69 completed questionnaires and 19 interviews. Unfortunately, there were more females than males because I largely distributed my questionnaire among the linguistics department and English studies, where predominantly female students are around. And at this point, I also want to say that Professor Pam Peters helped me massively with distributing my questionnaire and finding participants for my interviews. Okay, so in the questionnaire and the interviews, I wanted to look at the attitudes towards swearing, the lexicon used, the reasons and conditions for swearing, the use of euphemisms, how offensive some words are in the view of the students, the differences between the genders, and frequency in a lot of different ways of just total frequency overall and frequency of certain words and in certain contexts, as you will see in the results. Okay, let's get there. Okay, so here are my results. Yeah, generally, the students seem to have a positive attitude towards swearing, given that the context was appropriate in their opinion, and the context appropriateness largely depended on who they were with. For instance, with their friends or family is appropriate, whereas in more formal contexts, not as appropriate, as we will see. And generally, the males evaluated swearing a bit more positively than the females, but there were no statistically significant differences. And this is emblematic for the study in general. The females seem to be a little bit behind the males in swearing frequency and acceptance, but only a little bit. There were largely no statistically significant differences between the genders, which I find interesting. Yeah, So talking about frequency, I asked them to estimate how frequently they think they swear in their everyday life, and a vast majority indicated at least once a day or several times a day. And I asked him to give a rough estimate of what they think they might swear per day if they said several times a day, and that ranged from 3 to 10 per day to people claiming that they swore like every third sentence. But generally, of course, it's difficult to estimate yourself, but generally people thought that the majority thought that they swear every day. I was interested which influence had the presence of the opposite sex on swearing. And I found a very significant difference here, which is that the males in my study believed to swear more among their own sex, whereas the females didn't. Only 80% of the females indicated that they think they swear more in female-only conversations. And for them, for females, it didn't really seem to matter. Yeah, another point on frequency. I gave participants a list of 40 swear words that I selected from literature and based on the different taboo themes. So I kind of tried to address all the taboo themes that I showed before. And out of these 40, I here have the ones that were relatively frequent. So by relatively frequent, I mean that they at least were indicated to be used as seldom. Yeah. So the most frequent one was fuck, and then straightly followed by shit. Then god, damn, crap, dickhead, piss off, and so on. Interestingly, cunt wasn't that frequent, although I had thought that it might be used more frequently, since it's, I think, a general favorite, but probably relatively high in strength, so maybe not that frequent. And there were statistically significant differences between the sexes for dick, pussy, and cunt, which I find interesting. All of these denote genitalia, female and male. So, and all of them were more frequent among men. Okay. I also I didn't only give them a list of swear words where they had to rate how frequently they use those words. I also asked them to enter their favorite swear words, meaning not only not coming up with creative swearing on the spot, but I wanted them to write down what they think they use most frequently and very often, and what they like to use. So this exercise was a massive mistake on my side, because I got so many entries and I spent so much time going through them and trying to order them systematically. So it was a lot of work. I had 670 individual entries that were made by the 69 students, so quite a lot. And I broke them down into 160 lemmata. By that I mean I grouped them based on the word used in the entry. So there were 160 different lexemes used within these 670 individual entries made. And out of these 670 entries, there were 288 including the word fuck, 111 including the word shit, and there you can see a similarity to what students indicated they use frequently previously. Fuck, shit, and yeah, then followed by cunt, dick, hell, ass, bloody bitch, God, Jesus, and wanker, and everything below 10 entries I didn't include here, but there were a lot more with just single or entries. Yeah. To give you a little bit of the taste of what the entries look like, I put here a list of some of the more frequent ones, and I would like to point out that there were frequent combinations, frequent compounds that applied a set of reoccurring words. For instance, the swear words ass, cunt, dick, fuck, and shit, and the non-taboo words bag, brain, eater face, head, and hole reappeared in various combinations, also with each other or attached to anything. So for instance, whole, head could be attached to shit, fuck, dick, ass, and many more. So yeah, these kind of reoccurrences. And I looked a lot in detail at different at the morphosyntax of all the entries. And to give you an example, here's what I found for all the entries made for fuck. So fuck was largely entered just as a single word, which could be noun, verb, or interjection. In some cases, the way the entries were made, for instance, like fuck with a multitude of use and exclamation mark suggested interjectional use. There was also there's some music happening. The Irish English variant fact, which is a euphemistic form of fuck, was entered, and there were a couple of frames that included fuck. For instance, what the actual fuck, there's a typo there. Why the fuck, for fuck's sake, holy fuck, I don't give a fuck, and variations of that, like I don't give a flying fuck, and so on. Fuck also was found as a transitive verb, taking a variety of objects, for instance, fuck it, that, me, you, everything, this shit. Some of these function as formulas, like fuck you, fuck it, fuck me. For variants, fuck me sideways, fuck me dead, fuck me swinging. All of these are entries that were made. And then there were a few derivational forms, not a lot. We had fucker, fuckety, fuckaroo. Fuckaroo, interestingly to what I found, is not an Australian suffix, but actually American, from American English in origin, even though it might look Australian. And then there were a multitude of compounds, as I showed you previously, and adjectival and adverbial use. Yeah, functioning as an infix in more formulas or in blend. Right, okay, and yeah, I think I want to move on and wrap this up a bit. I'm running a bit late, as I can see. Okay, talking about functions of swearing, I found that largely the participants felt that they use it non-aggressively for autocatharsis or humorous reasons, and for social swearing among friends. And yeah, the female and male participants in that respect seem to use it relatively similar, or thought they use it similarly. Yeah, as I said before, swearing was indicated to largely be used frequently or very frequently among close friends, and but less so among grandparents or parents, or in more formal contexts like at university, at work, or in official contexts. And by official contexts, I gave them examples like at court or with the police, or at an administrative office. Yeah, euphemism was largely infrequent. I gave them a list of 21 euphemisms and asked them to rate how frequently they used those, and there were only 3 who were indicated to be used at least occasionally, which were what the heck, geez, and freaking. So generally, the students didn't seem to use any of the euphemisms I gave them frequently. And lastly, I asked about offensiveness, and I gave them 8 different excerpts from some were from corpora. I used the Griffith corpus for some of the examples, and some came from advertisements or TV. And I put in a couple of different functions and asked them to rate how offensive they thought these words were in the context given. Interestingly, Kant had the highest rating tending towards mild, which is also not that high, but it was the highest, even though, as we can see in the first example, it was used, no, in the second example, sorry, it was used in a humorous way among close friends. Generally the offensiveness was rated low in these examples, and maybe if I had picked other words, maybe racist terms or sexist terms, it would have been different. For my PhD, I will have a similar exercise, but with more words, and I included racist and sexist terms in that. So I'm curious for the results there. Okay. So in conclusion, the majority of the aspects addressed among the students I surveyed were similar to previous research involving swearing among students in, for instance, not just in Australian English, but as well as in American English, Irish English, and New Zealand English. And from what I gathered, the female and male participants indicated fairly regular swearing with friends, evaluated swearing largely positively, and perceived it as inoffensive or mild for the context I provided. And there were generally only very small differences between the sexes and only selectively statistically significant, with male swearing slightly more overall. Okay, so this was my master thesis, and to wrap things up, I want to talk about what I'm doing right now. While my master thesis was a brief overview, trying to pin down swearing and trying to describe all the aspects that I found relevant to swearing based on my literature research and everything. I wanted to move on in my PhD looking at how ethnicity influences swearing in Australia, because I thought that since Australia is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, I thought this must have an influence on swearing. The participants in my master thesis were largely Caucasian and largely of English, Irish, Anglo-Celtic origin. But I was interested in how do other groups fare with swearing in Australia. How do Australians of non-English speaking backgrounds swear in comparison to the Anglo-Celtic population? How does ethnic background affect attitudes towards swearing? How does the use and perception differ between first, second, third generation Australians? And for my master thesis, I want to look at Chinese, Italian, and Anglo-Celtic heritage. By Chinese, I mean Mandarin speaking. Buckaroo is not Australian. Are there any swear words that are primarily Australian and would not occur in other varieties of English? Yeah, I didn't find a lot in my research. I had been hoping to find a lot, but largely what is being used is also found in other varieties. I wrote down, I found from the entries the students made in my study, there were 3 examples. One is slazza, I can type that out. That seems to be Australian, from the suffixation in there. And yeah, the origin of Buckaroo is not entirely clear. It might be adopted or, yeah. So, and what else? What was the question? Other words that occur more commonly in Australia than elsewhere. Yeah, I can't answer that. Originally, I wanted to do a comparison of British and Australian swearing, and I'm still hoping to do that at some point. But at this point, I don't have information on that. Yeah. Yeah, US Tennessee, right. Okay. Where was I? Okay, so I'm looking for my master's, for my PhD, I'm looking at differences between Australians with Chinese, Italian, and Anglo-Celtic heritage. And I want to see what if they have differences in attitudes towards swearing, if their frequency overall differs. For instance, as I had in my masterpieces, numbers of swears per day, week, month, or frequency of certain expressions or in certain situations, or frequency in different with different people. And I also want to see how maybe if any swearing from their heritage languages is retained, and whether those are kept through the generations or not. So these are just some of my research questions, and I'm just gonna briefly show you my methodology and what I'm gonna do. This research is obviously largely based on my master thesis and an extension, so I'm working on the same theoretical foundation I established, but I kind of improved it a little bit. So I also compiled a questionnaire this time, which is new and improved, and based on what I learned from the first one I did. And I also want to do interviews, because I found that this really helps to understand the motivations and how people feel about swearing. And I want to record a natural occurring speech in private situations, which is going to be a challenge, but I'm up to it. And yeah, as I said, I want to focus on Italian, Chinese, that is Mandarin speaking, and Anglo-Celtic groups in Melbourne. And I want to generally focus on adults. There's not going to be like a limit, but I want to try to distribute it evenly. And obviously the older speakers will be harder to get. And there will be a variety of different socioeconomic backgrounds, and I want participants to have been either born in Australia or lived here since the age of 5, so went through Australian schooling. Yeah, so for the questionnaire, I hope to get at least 200 participants, and I hope this is what I'm hoping for here. So obviously it's not going to look like that when I'm done, but this is what I'm going for. And I'm just going to keep collecting and distributing my questionnaire until I reach somewhat of an equal distribution of ethnicity and gender. And we'll see what the count is in the end, the participant count. Okay, and for the recorded conversations, the idea is to record a variety of natural conversations occurring over dinner or lunch, or other social gatherings, which are not happening. For instance, I thought to go like to Chinese New Year Harvest Festival, or Italian Festa or something like that, to recruit people, with none of which is happening at the moment. I hope everything will happen at some point again. For each group, I want to record at least 3 different conversations: a family conversation, for a student conversation over lunch, and a conversation between co-workers. But this is really open. If I can get more different ones, I want to get everything I can. And the guideline is going to be that at least 2 members have to be either Chinese, Italian, or Anglo-Celtic in each conversation. So 2 Chinese, 2 Italian, or 2 Anglo-Celtic background, just to kind of establish some sort of ethnic grouping there. And I want the participants to record the conversations themselves, so I won't be present and don't influence it. They can just switch on their recording device on their phones, and then oh, well, there's a comment. I'm not here to fuck spiders. Oh yeah, that's an interesting one, which that was entered one time in my master's thesis questionnaire. And I saw it online once previously on a dating profile someone showed me. And recently a friend of mine also said that a coworker of hers, she's a chef, also said it. So so far I've heard it 3 times, but it wasn't that frequent in my study. I'm not sure if that's specifically Australian, but I'm going to look out for it. Okay, lastly, I want to do interviews, and there's going to be 24 participants. I want to have a blue collar, white collar divide, so 12 participants in each group. And yeah, I'm just going to discuss people's thoughts and attitudes towards swearing. Okay, sorry I took way longer than expected. Probably perhaps also because I answered questions in between, so that is it. Sorry, there's not a lot of time for discussion left. Sorry about that. Yeah, if anyone is interested in my study, here is my little flyer that I have ready to go with the details. And if anybody's interested in the study, participating, or knows someone who would like to participate, please reach out to me, and I would love to distribute this as much as possible, as soon as I have ethics clearance. Okay. Oh yeah, hi Kate, thank you. Swearing for Mandarin speakers is usually influenced by the heritage topic. Okay, what do you think is behind the new swearing? Where exquisite topics, jewelry, gift cards, are decorated with blown. Oh, okay. I have a slide for that. I didn't put it in the in the presentation, but I have tons of pictures of that. Just a second, I'm going to share that. Where is it? There, okay, check. An enthusiastic crest stitcher, interesting. Calligraph Fuck is a Melbourne-based company. Interesting. Yeah, there is so much out there. I find it amazing. I can't even take pictures of everything because there's too much. I think the use of this just shows how little offense it causes, I think. And it's largely used for humorous purposes, and I think, yeah, it just shows acceptance and the playfulness of swearing, I think. I want to ask about that in my interviews also, but there isn't a tremendous amount out there. And why am I making limitations? Because I have to make limitations somewhere. Originally, I wanted to include people who arrive here later in their as an adult, or because they also have an influence on the swearing found in Australia, of course. But I can't look at everyone. I went through it a lot of times, and I think I have to, because I have to limit it to that, just for the reasons of time and scope. What swearing would you expect from Mandarin speakers? Do they tend to use Chinese swear words? Well, I don't know. That's what I'm interested in.